thanks for joining us. I'm Jen Schanger from the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, the NJACE, which is funded in part by the New Jersey Governor's Council and the New Jersey Department of Health. To start today, I just wanted to go over some brief housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is pre-recorded, but there will be a live chat option when we first air this, so please feel free to ask questions or post your comments. And as always, we'd love to hear more about you. So if you're comfortable, please feel free to let us know a little about yourself in the chat. So now I would like to introduce today's guests. Bob Williams is Policy Director of CommunicationFIRST. He helped co-found the organization in 2019 after retiring from a distinguished 4-decade career in federal and state government and the nonprofit sector, most recently as Director of U.S. Independent Living Administration at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He's a nationally recognized leader on policy issues relating to supporting people with the most significant disabilities to live, work, and thrive in their own homes and communities. For over 60 years, Mr. Williams has relied on an array of augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, strategies, including a series of speech-generating devices over the past 3 decades. He lives with his wife in Washington, D.C., where they enjoy visits with the grandkids, walking along the riverfront, Netflix binges, me too, and all things Springsteen. Welcome, Bob. And next we have Tauna Samanski, who's the Executive Director and Legal Director of CommunicationFIRST, the only civil rights organization dedicated to protecting and advancing the rights and interests of the estimated 5 million people in the United States who cannot rely on speech to be understood. Before joining CommunicationFIRST in 2019, she spent 20 years working on climate change law and policy, including 13 years at an international law firm in London and Washington, D.C., where she volunteered and represented clients pro bono in disability rights and inclusive education matters. Ms. Szymanski has graduate degrees in law and public policy. She grew up around the world as the child of U.S. Foreign Service officers and is multiply disabled. Welcome, Tauna.
Thank you.
So you are both going to talk to us today about how important communication access is. I'm super excited, and I am going to hand it over to both of you now, and then I'll come back at the end for some Q&A.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. All right, I'm going to try to share my screen here. And is that good? All right. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I want to just describe myself. First of all, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and I have a wonky left eye. Today I'm wearing a rust-colored sweater. Behind me is a bookshelf, yellow walls, and a window with shutters. So I'm sharing my screen, and the first slide has a blue background with the CommunicationFIRST logo and white lettering that says communication access is fundamental, along with our names and titles. So before I hand it over to Bob, I'll briefly introduce the new organization we're building, CommunicationFIRST, so you have some context on where we're coming from today. So Bob and I co-founded CommunicationFIRST in 2019 because we saw the need for an organization dedicated to protecting and advancing the civil rights of the 5 million people in the United States who cannot rely on speech alone to be understood. We decided it was important to have a cross-disability focus, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later, and that it should be led by people with disabilities. Our population is incredibly diverse. There's over 24 identified disabilities and conditions associated with difficulty speaking, and we seek to represent people who are both born with such disabilities, including people with autism, Down syndrome, and rare genetic syndromes, but also those who acquire speech loss later in life, including because of conditions like ALS, stroke, and Parkinson's. And the reason for that is that regardless of the cause for the speech-related disability, all people who experience that face barriers being understood, and most experience discrimination, isolation, vulnerability, and marginalization. And we publicly launched just 6 months before the pandemic. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who during his 4-decade career in the government and the nonprofit sector has become a nationally recognized leader in policy issues relating to supporting people with the most significant disabilities to live, work, and thrive in their own homes and communities. When Bob was born with significant cerebral palsy in the 1950s, his parents were told to put him in a state institution and to never look back. Thankfully for us, his parents rejected that advice. He has in fact closed down multiple institutions and worked on the Olmsted case before the US Supreme Court. So Bob?
Thanks. Before I answer that, I want to note I want to begin by stating the obvious, the only reason I am speaking to you today is that over $60 years ago, my parents brothers and sisters able to create our AAC strategies that worked for us. I want to begin by stating the obvious. The only reason I am speaking to you today is that over 60 years ago, my parents, brothers, and sisters were able to create our own AAC strategies that worked for us.
So Bob, I think it might be helpful to the audience if you could tell us a little bit about how that worked, what kind of AAC strategies were developed, and how you gained access to effective communication when you were growing up.
Yeah.
Before I answer that, I want to note that when I give a presentation, I prepare most of what I am going to say in advance. This enables me to speak one sentence at a time. For those that might not be watching, let me set the scene. I am an older white man sitting at a long wooden table in my home office in Southwest DC. On top of the table is my computer as well as the speech generating device I am using. It is also evident I have significant motoric and speech disabilities. I have had cerebral palsy throughout my life. On the wall to my left are photos of family and friends. A piece of wood with the alphabet and numbers 0 through 9 stenciled in black letters is also visible. It is the board I used as a teenager. I keep it there, as I have in every office I have ever had, as a reminder of my journey, the possibilities of others, and the duty to start where people are and support them on their journey by bridging what as Eliot writes of as the incalculable distance between, quote, what might have been and what is. Many tell me I have lived an exceptional life. They are right, and I am proud of much of what I have done, as well as deeply indebted to my parents, family, teachers, mentors, friends, bosses, colleagues, and others who have spurred me on. But the fact of the matter is, I view being an exception to the rule, a mere fluke, because of what I have been able to make up my life and career as grievously maddening. I believe my life, while molded by many factors, has been made possible by the following. Above all else, the love and belief that my family and others have had in me. From a very young age, I also had a ready supply of ways to communicate and connect. When I was 6 or 7, my occupational therapist wanted to improve my fine motor coordination. So she plopped me down in front of an IBM electric typewriter. She likely believed I would simply hand back at random letters, numbers, and symbols. Instead, I began to spell words and short sentences. Years later, my teacher at the time told me this fluke incident was the only thing that convinced her I could ever read and write. It was another chance of a lifetime I was lucky to experience. But it should have never been left to chance in the 1960s. And it definitely should not be left up to chance in 2021. When I was about 15, my camp counselor painted the alphabet in bold black capital letters on a piece of wood. I pointed to letters to spell out words and sentences. A year or two later, that same camp counselor handed me a green board that had letters, numbers, words, and phrases on it. It was called the Hall Row Communication Board and named for the man with cerebral palsy who helped design it, and it saw me through high school, college, dating, internships, and my first 2 full-time jobs. In fact, I used that board to lobby with others to gain passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And Bob, when did you start using a speech generating device like the one you're using today?
Actually, it was 30 years ago this past summer. I have been using successive iterations of the same device over this period. Being able to use such technology combined with the internet and other digital innovation has transformed my and others' lives and futures in ways and degrees that remain unfathomable to many. There are, of course, many ways to express ourselves. Humor is among the most universal. This is a picture of a meeting several disability advocates had with President Obama on health reform in 2009. I had the honor of speaking first. Before launching into my remarks, though, I took a moment of privilege to make the following points. The first was that, as he has repeatedly said about his life, my life also could only have become true in this place and idea we call America. And then, for good measure, I further observed that while I am older than him, he faced a far higher on the job risk of turning gray sooner. He looked at me for the longest split second I have ever known, and then broke into his wide grin and cracked up along with everyone else. I have spoken truth to power to many leaders during my years in DC, but that will always be the sweetest and most memorable. To make this president crack up, now that's the power of communication, and quite priceless.
So what is AAC and who needs it? So AAC just stands for augmentative and alternative communication, which is just a clunky way of referring to really anything other than speech that can help a person be understood. So AAC and communication generally, of course, includes gestures, eye gaze, pointing, facial expressions, sounds, body positioning, laughing, smiling. It can also include pointing or looking at pictures or icons, which can be either low tech or high tech. And it can also include what we refer to as robust language-based AAC, which also can come in no, low, or high tech forms. And those could include writing, signing, typing, texting, pointing to letters and words that can be combined to communicate anything. And then finally can also include someone who's familiar with a person's speech, who repeats what they are saying to someone who might not be able to understand their speech. That's called a revoicer. And many people, in fact, use multiple forms of these. So this slide just shows a few images of various kinds of AAC systems, including no, low, and high-tech systems. So what's the key message we want you to take away from this webinar? If you've never not been able to speak or get your point across effectively, it's probably never occurred to you just how important and fundamental communication access is. Communication is so fundamental to being human and to being treated as human that it's important is really impossible to overstate. Effective language-based communication is essential to accessing an appropriate education, to emotional well-being, to exercising your rights as a citizen, to having reciprocal social relationships, to personal safety, like being able to say no and to ask for help, to determining what happens in your day-to-day life and over the long term, to having a meaningful job, to your mental health, and to being able to access healthcare, to communicate your symptoms, to ask questions of doctors, and to provide informed consent. And fundamentally, we'd like people to remember that communication is about human connection. And communication is the natural human desire to connect and interact. And that must never be denied. So as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of our population lacks access to robust language-based AAC. There's an assumption that people who cannot speak or move their body in controlled, reliable ways are incapable of understanding language. What typically happens, even today, is that young people who are born without the ability to speak are never given a fair shot at accessing robust AAC. They're presumed to lack communicative intent because they don't move their bodies in ways that people without disabilities typically move their bodies to communicate something. They have neuromotor conditions that prevent them from nodding or shaking their heads or pointing or holding a pencil or signing. Typically, what happens today is that the first form of what sometimes is called AAC, but really is nothing more than a type of requesting system rather than robust AAC, is to provide them with a system of small laminated cards with cartoonish pictures or photos on them to indicate food, drink, the bathroom, or a favorite toy. And when the child doesn't use these cards in the expected manner to request the thing on the card, they are presumed to not understand or to lack communicative intent. When they don't use these words or these cards to communicate, even after months or years of being given access to them, the student is rarely given anything else. They haven't mastered the system or proven they can communicate or understand language. And as a result, they're denied access to additional training and supports and to other types of AAC that might be better aligned to their needs and preferences. So this turns into a vicious cycle. The student isn't given the tools to show they're capable of understanding and using language, but are denied access to the very tools they need to do so. And this is all despite the fact that we know there is no human condition or disability that prevents some understanding and production of language, none. And the costs of denying someone access to effective communication are immeasurable. Years of missed education, isolation, mental health issues. You have no choice but to communicate with what is referred to as maladaptive behavior because you've never been given any other way to communicate. And then you're punished for that behavior. And of course, without communication, you're denied all the opportunities in life that people without disabilities take for granted. Opportunities to socialize, to be educated, to contribute to society, to work, to vote, and to take risks. And perhaps most importantly, people who are denied access to communication are often dehumanized. We believe that a strong case can be made that if you've ever experienced significant barriers to communication for any period of time, there's an extremely high likelihood that you've experienced trauma. We believe there's a good case to be made that all people who need but haven't been provided the tools and supports to access robust AAC should be treated by educators and other professionals using what are known as trauma-informed practices. A couple of months ago, we were joined by 47 other organizations in a call to action to the new administration to begin to address some of these issues with policy and guidance. We called for 9 key steps to be achieved in the first 6 months of the administration, including some of the systemic unmet needs we're touching on today. You can see the full call to action on our website. I've just highlighted a few of the points here on the slide, but we have the full call to action can be accessed in the perspective section of our website. And we are and will continue to work to advance each of these issues in different policy forums. So, Bob, you want to go through some of the key principles?
Take a look at the call to action. Because while much of it relates to the pandemic, the actions we call for can be game-changing, both now and in the future, especially for young people who use or need to access AAC. For if we want to offer true equality of opportunity to kids who need to use it to succeed at home, in school, in their work and careers, in community with all others, we must make accessing AAC happen as early, easy, and supportive as possible. It must become ubiquitous and a universal right and reality. We all must play our part making that happen. Studies also show far more must be done to make such technology and the necessary related services universally available, affordable, and accessible to those who need it regardless of age, disability, race, ethnicity, primary language, or other socioeconomic status. All of this also must be done in a way that makes certain that the person who relies on AAC is the one choosing to use the device or strategy. Regardless of how young or how old we are, those that use AAC often are pummeled with messages from multiple different sources and directions about our perceived inability and unworthiness to express ourselves in ways that others think it is either appropriate or inappropriate for us to do so. For many of us, this leaves only one path of action open: obstinance and resistance. No one wants to be endlessly instructed in what, when, how, or where we can say what we want, nor to be informed of our so-called deficits in doing so. The vast majority of you who can speak clearly, freely, and without anyone doubting what you say have little to no idea how this feels and what it yields. But take it from me, it is terribly oppressive and demoralizing.
Do not delay providing AAC to anyone. We believe AAC should begin to be introduced as soon as there is an indication of a speech delay, as early as 12 months. Evidence shows that introducing AAC does not hinder speech development and in fact fosters it. Traditional speech therapy should be worked on in parallel with AAC training.
All kids and families that need AAC have a right to the same early opportunities and support. Janice and Herdy Moffer. These must become the rule, not the exception. If that is not happening here, make it happen. When I was born, and even more tragically and enraging to this day, the bias persists that if someone has little to no understandable speech, we cannot possibly understand or have any need, much less an affirmative right to language. So why bother? Period. End of story. This is as true for one who acquires a significant expressive disability at birth or when they are 2 years older. And the real life discriminatory impacts and consequences are equally preventable and thus untenable. I know many young adults who obtained access to AAC as teenagers and are now going to college, earning bachelor's and graduate degrees. They are making up for lost time and the terrible injustice done to them, creating futures that still elude many others. Clearly, we must not allow any kid to wait any longer. Moreover, we must recognize that for those who have not had effective access to AAC for decades, their right and ability to benefit from it and our obligation to create this access never ends. Human agency, the power and choice to shape one's life and chances, begins when we are young with reinforcing acts of self-expression and thus self-determination. Kids with significant communication disabilities are like all others. In order to thrive throughout life, they must be afforded the continuing opportunities and support to experience and exert the same intrinsic power. To me, literacy is the ability and the right to continuously learn, use, and strengthen our skills and self-confidence, to read, write, and use language to communicate, connect, and live in community with each other in the most optimal ways we can do so as individuals. There is a reason enslaved people and generations following them were legally barred from learning or teaching others to read and write. Literacy is key to every freedom we have, and few know it better than I. We need to make certain that all of the young people you work with have equally effective access to the same range of literacy, learning, and skill development opportunities. None of us reads, writes, or uses language in the same ways, but optimizing our individual capacity to do so is essential for bridging those differences and enabling us to better connect and communicate with one another. Although some certainly enter its most egregious forms more than others, as individuals and a group, we all experience the same brutal barrage of prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, and to be routinely seen by many as incapable of human expression and connection. We know all too well the many harsh forms it can take, including social isolation, loneliness, and ostracism, as well as what it feels like to be regarded as the other. This must end, and literacy is key to breaking free of all of this. And it is why in our communication equity call to action to the Biden-Harris administration, we stress that all children and adults who need AAC must have equally effective access to lifelong literacy learning opportunities. None of us reads, writes, or uses language in the same ways, but optimizing our individual capacity to do so is essential to bridging those differences and enabling us to better connect and communicate with one another.
Okay, so here's a sort of thought, something to think about. So true or false question. It's safe to assume that someone who can't speak can't understand what you're saying. In other words, is it okay to speak about someone right in front of them? The answer to that is false or no. And here's why. As any speech language pathologist can tell you, language and speech are processed and produced in separate parts of the brain. They are completely different brain functions, speech and language are. As you can see from this graphical representation created by Linda Robinson in 2010 of the human brain, speech or saying words is depicted in the red area, which is the motor cortex. Speech, in other words, is a motor function. By contrast, the acts of reading, hearing, and thinking about words take place in the green, orange, and blue areas in this image. Those are the areas of the brains that handle cognitive function. In other words, speech is a motor function and language is a cognitive function. Speech and language are produced in different parts of the brain. And if someone can't speak, there is an extremely good chance that the reason for that relates to a motor impairment, not a language impairment. There is also a good chance that they have other motor impairments like difficulty controlling their head and neck to nod or shake their head, or to form signs with their hands, or to hold and manipulate a pencil to write, or to type with precision. Speech is the finest of fine motor skills. And by the way, this is also why the field is moving away from the term nonverbal. That term is simply factually inaccurate to describe someone who cannot speak. The term verbal means relating to or in the form of words. So calling a person who can't speak nonverbal means you are saying they are incapable of forming words, which is probably something you have no evidence for. And beyond being inaccurate, the term is harmful. Calling someone nonverbal makes other people have low expectations of that person. So please don't do it. So what else should you call people? Autistic people in particular tend to prefer to be called non-speaking. At Communication First, we honor individual preferences, but we describe our cross-disability constituency generally and more specifically as people who cannot rely on speech alone to be heard or understood. And please never ever use the terms low functioning or high functioning. I'm sure you've had a bunch of other webinars here about those terms. But the question sort of is, would you have described Stephen Hawking, for instance, as low functioning, and why or why not? So functioning labels generally are imprecise, unhelpful, ableist, and demeaning. So a point on IQ tests. So IQ tests that exist today, all of them rely on the test taker's ability to accurately and intentionally move some part of their body. So as such, if someone has any kind of speech or motor disability, an IQ test will not accurately measure the intelligence, cognitive abilities, and potential of that person. All commonly used measures of cognitive ability require the test taker to use speech, to point accurately, or to write. There is substantial published literature demonstrating that IQ tests are invalid and inappropriate for people who cannot speak and should not be given to people who do not have access to robust AAC. Because IQ tests are used to erect barriers and inevitably result in teachers assigning low expectations, they should never be used on people who cannot speak and who don't have access to robust AAC. They simply are not evidence-based, and their use on this population is unethical, and they can cause great harm. So we encourage you to always question your assumptions. Here's a thought experiment. If you came upon this person on the sidewalk, what assumptions would you make about his cognitive abilities, especially if you didn't recognize him? So that was Stephen Hawking in the 1980s. If Stephen Hawking didn't have a degenerative condition, but had been born without the ability to speak, do you think huge companies like Intel would have bent over backwards to invent and tailor new technologies to ensure he could communicate effectively? Why is it that we prioritize access to communication for some over others, even though it is a human and civil right for everyone? So we were asked to touch a bit more specifically on communication rights in the education context. In the US, 3 key laws protect students with disabilities in the pre-K to age 2022 context. There's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and there's the Americans with Disabilities Act. All three apply at the same time, and each provides slightly different protections in relation to students with communication disabilities. In general, the IDEA is about providing services. So under the IDEA, which is the special education law, school districts are required to evaluate the need for and to provide assistive technology and AAC devices and services as soon as possible. Schools must provide not just the technology, which can include no, low, or high-tech technology, but also must customize, repair, and replace the device, and must train not just the student, but also the student's parents and teachers to ensure they are able to learn to use robust AAC to communicate effectively. The ADA, by contrast, is focused primarily on access, equal opportunity, and overcoming barriers. When it adopted the ADA in 1990, Congress recognized or said discrimination against people with disabilities includes the failure to provide equal access to opportunities, programs, activities, and services. It also includes a failure to modify existing policies and practices if that's needed to accommodate people with disabilities, and even includes a failure to address and remove communication barriers more specifically. The ADA regulations require public entities like schools to, quote, ensure that communications with people with disabilities are, quote, as effective as communications with others. That means they are required to provide what are known as auxiliary aids and services, which is just a fancy way of saying accommodations for people who have a communication disability. So in addition to their obligations to provide AAC as an assistive technology device or service under the IDEA, schools are also required to provide whatever auxiliary aids and services are required to ensure students are able to communicate effectively to afford them equal access to the education and services the school is providing to students without disabilities. In addition to communication access, the ADA also ensures, excuse me, that people with even the most significant disabilities are not unnecessarily excluded, segregated, and denied access to educational and other opportunities that the school provides. These provisions are in addition to the least restrictive environment provisions in the IDEA. And finally, the ADA requires schools and other public entities to make reasonable modifications in their policies, practices, or procedures if necessary to avoid discriminating on the basis of disability. I'll provide an example of what this might look like in the context of COVID-19 in a second. So Bob shared some guiding principles to consider when working with and parenting anyone who cannot rely on speech to be understood. We wanted to leave you with a few slightly more concrete tips for working with students. First, it's not best practice to impose prerequisites for introducing a robust communication system. As we discussed, there's no biological or anatomical basis to presume a person who cannot speak cannot understand and to learn to produce language if they are given the right tools and supports. Students who need AAC should be given access to the entire alphabet so they can communicate whatever they need to and want to. Limiting access to only certain words you think they might want to communicate is control and manipulation, and many AAC users have called that a form of abuse. This should go without saying, but if a student's AAC must be available to them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it must travel to and from school with them, be available to them on the bus and on the playground, because without AAC, they have no way to communicate effectively. A backup AAC system should be ready at a moment's notice in case the main one gets lost or damaged. And finally, the people supporting the AAC user must be adequately trained to support and foster their use of AAC. As this quote from lowtechsolutions.org notes, the effectiveness of an AAC system is often dependent on the effectiveness of what they call the communication partner. So before we conclude and take questions, I wanted to touch briefly on something that is relevant to the times we currently find ourselves in. These are just a few examples of the types of accommodations that might be available to a student with a disability under any of the IDEA, ADA, or Section 504, if that student needs access to instruction, needs to access virtual instruction for safety and health reasons because of COVID-19. I won't read through them all, but they're available on the slide. And we've also created a more in-depth toolkit, which we released last September, about the rights of students with disabilities to equal access and opportunity in virtual settings. And you can find that on our website. There's a link there. And finally, I've just included here a list of additional resources that that we sort of touched on that we've created as well in the past that you can also find on our website. And those are our email addresses and a link to our website. And we're happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you so much. I'm always singing this same tune as far as making sure that people get access as early as possible. And I'm so grateful that you can both be here to tell us more about that. So I actually have a few questions that I'm going to pose to, I think I'm going to start with Bob, if that's okay with you, Bob. So a couple of things. One of the things that you touched on was kind of the assumptions that people make. And a lot of times when other people meet someone who, you know, has a speech disability, they do assume that the person can't understand, and they may say a lot of things in front of the person, you know, unintentionally hurtful, but you know, so my question to you is, was that a common experience for you? And what advice do you have for caregivers? Like caregivers can't be with their kids all of the time, or, you know, an adult. How do we talk to our loved one who can't rely on speech about how it feels when those things happen?
Well, to start with, it all still is a extremely common experience for me and most other AAC users. I know. Well, to start with, that still is an extremely common experience for me and most other AAC users I know.
Okay.
I think. One thing my parents did was to recognize and reinforce in me. Who they knew to be. And to this day, I still draw on that. Counter narrative to help blood the bias and sometime hateful comments of I think one thing my parents did was to recognize and reinforce in me who they knew me to be. And to this day, I still draw on that counter narrative to help blunt the bias and sometimes hateful comments of others.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that, Bob. I think most people may not realize the impact that their words have. And I know for myself, I think about a lot of how things that my child is exposed to and hears about what others think make a big impact on her and how she feels about herself. So I really,
That is the trauma. Tauna mentioned, and the challenge is how someone both works through it and two. Channel it to do what you can to prevent its damage to yourself and others. That is the trauma Tauna mentioned, and the challenge is how someone both works through it and to channel it to do what you can to prevent its damage to yourself and others.
yeah.
I would just add too, we have sort of 3 parts to our mission, and a huge part of 1/3 of it at least is what we call public engagement, but it's really sort of changing hearts and minds about people who can't rely on speech to be understood and challenging those assumptions and humanizing this population, right? And stopping those hateful comments and language and that sort of thing. So we have a massive task ahead of us, but we're optimistic that we'll try to put a dent into at least in the next coming decades. So So it shouldn't just be on the people who suffer that, those indignities. It should be on all of
Right.
the rest of us to
Yes.
stop causing those indignities, right? So
Exactly. And that kind of goes back to the communication partner piece. So another thing that I would love for you to address, Tauna, actually, so as you mentioned, a lot of people face roadblocks in trying to get access. I've heard from a lot of families who, they'll attempt to get an AAC evaluation. A school may try it for them for 1 month and then decide it's not working out. Then, the access is removed. They likely don't get another chance for a long time, if at all. Then there's other cases where, a professional is telling them that the child, should only start with, say, 4 words or 4 buttons. Clearly, we don't restrict verbal speech in that way. And so it's really, it's really discriminatory practice. So do you have advice for like recourse that people can take if they're finding themselves with these various roadblocks? And what do you suggest that they do?
Well, I mean, there's certainly legal recourse if that's what you were sort of suggesting, but I think in general, the probably better, more efficient way probably to address this issue, which occurs every single day, even in the most highly resourced school districts in the country, and in other settings, before school even starts for kids, is really just education, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, this is going to take forever, but generally, especially in school systems, if a student has a communication disability, there's a referral to like the speech language therapist on staff, right? They're sort of in charge of communication issues generally in school districts. And, even folks who are graduating today from these programs, these schools, like my understanding is most of them have maybe a day at most, or an hour on AAC. I mean, it's like it's the unusual school that has a full course on it, much less a specialty. So, I mean, most of the sort of quote unquote experts who are supposed to be addressing these needs really don't have any expertise or training in how to support these students and to provide access to robust AAC. So, and even those that are sort of more educated on these issues, there's a lag. I mean, first of all, those people are few and far between, but like the folks who are more senior who didn't have any of that, it's like, okay, but now we have to educate all these people and bring them up to speed. I mean, this field is really in its infancy. I mean, it's only been 30 to 40 years that anyone has been working on these issues and trying to develop AAC, and it's very early days. I mean, we do not have good AAC. Like it is just not there, I mean, I'm sort of holding out ideally for that sort of brain computer, thoughts translate, like I firmly believe in the next 10 to 20 years, we'll have something like that. I mean, but in the meantime, we've got to do our best. It's on all of us to remove those barriers and to try and to not limit and not make assumptions about people's capacity to use language. There's, like I said, there's no disability or there's no level of intellectual disability in particular that precludes the use of language. Anyone can learn to read and use language and express it. So it's really not okay to stop at the 4-word thing or whatever it is, or to give up if pictures don't work or whatever. So we've all got to keep trying. And I don't think it should be just left to speech language pathologists, no offense to them, but it's really on everyone, right, to figure this out. So even in your day-to-day work, if you encounter someone who is trying to communicate something or seems to need to, we've all got to find creative ways to do that. I just wanted to put a plug in for another webinar you hosted a few months ago by Rudy Regan. She just did a fantastic job, I think, of introducing some of those concepts and how to support communication, particularly in people who don't currently have access to what we call robust language-based AAC, what Bob's using. For instance, I thought it was brilliant. So highly recommend that one.
Thank you. I agree. And part of what I loved about the the conversation that I had with her is it was such an acknowledgement of all of the communication that people have, regardless of whether they speak with their mouths.
Right.
And that's such an overlooked thing in general with, people with disabilities. I think that, we overvalue verbal speech and kind of ignore the rest. And it's just, again, it's like these ableist practices that we've had that we need to address and we need to talk about and, ask, almost demand that people do better. And, the burden should not be on the person with the disability. It needs-
Hopefully. It will not take as long. But we need to learn and apply what the deaf community did in its struggle for the right to sign language the parallels are striking. Hopefully, it will not take as long, but we need to learn and apply what the deaf community did in its struggle for the right to sign language. The parallels are striking.
Yeah, in many ways, we're like 140 years behind that community, not just in terms of access to communication, but also in terms of perceptions, right? So
Yeah.
I know it's not perfect, but it's not that common for folks to sort of assume things about deaf people's ability to use language, right? They're not just
Right.
immediately dehumanized, right? So
Yeah.
in many ways we look to what they've been able to achieve in the last, especially sort of 50 years, as a real model for us. I mean, we have them to thank for great laws that protect communication, right? So but yeah, we definitely sort of look to them as a sort of model of where we'd like to be, and yeah, hopefully not in 140 years, a little bit less time than that. But yeah, lots of parallels. That's a good point.
Yeah. One other thing I definitely wanted to ask you both about your thoughts on like the ethics of a particular practice that seems pretty common in kids, at least. I hope people still don't do this to adults, but there's like a lot of there's like a big push in some ways for parents or professionals working with people to kind of make access to items more difficult so that they can evoke speech or, requesting or whatever the case may be. Some will say that it's a way to create motivation. I would argue you don't need to do that. Motivation is to connect with other people. But what are your thoughts on withholding desired items, like as an attempt to prompt speech? And Bob, I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you, but if you did, what did you think about it? How did you feel?
Now,
There is relatively what I said earlier. If you back someone into a corner by requiring them to communicate in a way of your choosing, not theirs. The response is they will resist. And if they are like me, they will shut down. Completely. Expression is power and rests on respect and trust. We are not pale-ups. Dog. It is what I said earlier. If you back someone into a corner by requiring them to communicate in a way of your choosing, not theirs, the responses, they will resist. And if they are like me, they will shut down. Completely expression is power, and it trusts on respect and trust. We are not pale-ups, dog.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just gonna, there's nothing really to add to that except like, you know, the point of communication is understanding and connection, right? And if you're telling someone that you're rejecting their attempt at communication, that's not going to foster understanding and connection, right? It just,
Yeah.
right.
It makes it more about power as opposed to.
Right. And why would we make it more difficult for the person in the communication
Right.
to express themselves? Like the people who have the greatest barriers, why would we make it more difficult for them to communicate? It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And again, it's not something we do to people who can speak.
Right.
Okay, so the last big thing I would like to talk to you both about is there was controversy recently about Sia's movie called Music. And then in response, your organization got together and put out this amazing video. So could you tell us kind of more about the situation for people who aren't overly familiar with all of that, and then tell us about Listen and how people can watch it?
Sure. So there's a bit of a backstory. We in late November, a preview for her movie Music was released. I will just say I had actually never heard of Sia until I got a text from one of our members in late November saying, "Have you been on Twitter lately?" And I was like, "No, you know, we very short staffed, few resources here. We don't have like a huge social media presence." And I was not, I don't even to this day, don't really understand Twitter. Anyway, so this person was like, "Yeah, there's this thing came out. It's really offensive. People are up in arms, and I think you guys should make a statement." And I'm like, so the movie, her Mute movie, just as background, is a fictional account or fictional story that features a non-speaking autistic character, a teenage girl. So we were asked to issue a statement, and in our statement, our board members sort of put together, you know, basically like, and a lot of the issue was how she reacted to the criticism from the autistic community, which was not ideal, to say the least. So one of the things we suggested, we laid out sort of a bunch of things that she could do to sort of move forward and make amends. And one of them was to create an introductory short to the movie that would feature real non-speaking autistic people. So one of the issues was this character was played by a typical non-autistic person, and it looked like a caricature, and that was very offensive to folks. So we said, well, you know, short of pulling the film, you know, you could create a short and then maybe something at the end that would say, you know, help educate your viewers on this sort of thing. You know, we did that, and that was what I thought would be the end of it. We didn't hear anything. And then on Christmas Eve, we got, so Sia tweeted something that said, "Communication first, we'd be happy to fund you guys to do a short as an intro to our movie." And we're like, holy cow, okay. So anyway, long story short, we had some communications with her manager, and it didn't end up happening. So in January, we formed a committee of non-speaking autistic folks to preview the movie. So we said the first step, we'll watch the movie and we'll see, you know, what we can do from then on. But, you know, time was short. The US release date was February 12th. So anyway, so a group of folks watched this movie, the preview, in late January, and were pretty horrified. And by that point, actually, additional scenes had been leaked that showed prone restraint, and that was way more concerning, especially to us. I mean, this is a massive issue for our community. The very first lawsuit we filed was about restraint and seclusion in public school settings. Huge issue for us, and we were very concerned, and it had been public through these tweets that we were apparently working together. And so we were increasingly concerned that it was looking like we were okay with this, and
Right.
you know, when it had just been released. So we didn't get the preview, and then we kept writing to the manager. We said, look, we're concerned about this. We've seen these previews. We need to take some kind of public action on this, to release a statement of concern. We're concerned this is going to cause violence. They sent us the movie. And we had a couple people on the committee actually couldn't finish watching it. It was that disturbing to them, and some wouldn't actually watch it because they had heard about the restraint scenes. So we got together so we're a cross disability organization representing non-speaking folks, not autistic focused. So we thought, let's pair it together with two other organizations, one focused on autism, one focused on restraint seclusion. So we partnered with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network on the autism side, and then on the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint on that issue, and issued a joint statement sort of saying we're not, criticizing the scenes and encouraging her to take them out before the US release date. After we had seen the preview in late January, we had sent a whole list of suggestions to her that our viewers had written out and suggested, and we never heard anything back from them. And so when we sent that, we said, we're going to give you some time to review this and let us know what your plan is. And depending on your response, we'll tailor our sort of press statement accordingly. And we never heard back after that. So we had sent that to them, I think, on January 31st or thereabouts. And we felt we needed to release something at least a week before the US release date to warn people not to watch the movie, because we really believe that the movie, by normalizing the use of prone restraint, could cause violence and potentially death. I mean, this is something that's banned in many states in the US, right?
Yeah.
It can kill people. So we were very concerned about it. It was right around that time when we issued that press statement, I think it was on February 3rd, if I'm remembering correctly, that we decided, a couple of people said, well, you guys should think about just trying to do a short anyway. We didn't have a budget for making a movie or any experience, but we're like, hey, let's see if we can do it. So like in about 10 days, we somehow recruited like almost entirely autistic sort of cast of folks, project manager, musician, filmmaking folks, and sort of pulled together this 5-minute movie that we called Listen, featuring real non-speaking autistic people. Because we had such short period of time, we couldn't do any sort of filming, and it's COVID, obviously. So we asked people to send in sort of existing footage. Some people recorded themselves. The folks at the beginning recorded sort of new statements and that sort of thing, and we used that. We found a musician who recorded music especially for this. She's autistic. Our non-speaking autistic board member, Jordan Zimmerman, worked with an autistic project manager on the storyboard and the script. The narrator, voiceover person from South Africa is autistic. It was just a yeah. I mean, I didn't sleep very much that week, but it was really kind of fun. And I mean, part of the point was not just to sort of show, have the final results, but was to show how you could work with non-speaking autistic people on a project like this, and to involve them, fully 100% in every stage of the project, which is, some of the criticism that Sia received for her movie music, which was that if she involved folks at all, it was sort of minimally, right? So we were able to show that with no budget, with no experience, something like this, we were able to sort of pull something together very quickly that was, halfway decent, I guess. And, I don't know, 70,000 views, I think, so far, which to us is viral for a very small, brand new organization. But we've been really gratified by it. And we're just also in the process of releasing 3 or 4 shorter versions. So that one's 5 minutes. And One is called About Us, which we just released a few days ago, that can be used in different formats and stuff. So yeah, it's been a little fun, something we did not expect at all, but it's been kind of fun.
That's awesome. We'll make sure that we put the links like in the video description so people can see it too.
Yeah, it's communicationfirst.org/listen is the easiest way to go. And it's on our YouTube channel. And we just are releasing it like their subtitles and captions, and we're producing different language versions. And then there's an audio described version that will be released today as well. So
wow,
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So Bob, I wanted to see if you could leave us with final thoughts. What if you could just leave something for future and current AAC users, what would you tell them? I know it's a very open-ended question.
You are not alone. We are not aligned. Alone. And together. We will. Create greater opportunities and justice. You are not alone. We are not alone. And together we will create greater opportunities and justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here with us, for your advocacy. Bob, I've already told you this, but it means so much to me to meet you, especially Tauna, you know, I admire you so much as well. And just thank you for everything that you both do. To everyone watching, check out Communication First. We'll link to that in the comments. And thank you both again.
The opportunity.